CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Russia orders its soldiers to withdraw from the strategically important city of Kherson in Ukraine.
Our other headlines: control of the US Congress on a knife edge as Democrats stave off the red wave surge from the Republicans in midterm elections.
China says it's willing to contribute towards a compensation fund for poorer nations hit by climate change as world powers gather in Egypt for COP27.
Greek workers clash with the police as a general strike to protest against the cost of living turns violent.
China's factory gate prices drop for the first time in almost 2 years, while consumer inflation eases from a 29-month high.
And trouble in the metaverse. The owner of Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp cuts 13% of the workforce. That's 11,000 jobs. Russia is pulling its troops out of the Ukrainian city of Kherson. Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, has ordered ground forces to withdraw from the west bank of the Dnipro River. Senior Russian generals say it's no longer possible to maintain supply lines, and this action is needed to save soldiers' lives.
It will be seen as a major breakthrough for Ukraine. 9 months into the war, Kherson is the only regional capital to have fallen under Moscow's control since the invasion in February. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Giles Gibson. So, Giles, how significant is this?
This is a very significant development in this war that's now in its 9th month. Just to underline the geography of all of this, what Russia is saying is that they are pulling their forces back from the western bank of the Dnipro River. This is a really strategically important river that runs through eastern Ukraine, and of course Kherson, that city that you mentioned, sits right on the western bank of the Dnipro River. So what we are seeing from Russia is they are now announcing that they are moving their forces across the river, trying to use that river as a strategic barrier, if you like, as we've seen Ukrainian forces making more and more advances in recent months in this autumn offensive that they've launched. And now really the key question, I think, that NATO powers such as Estonia, where I am, the UK, the US, the question they'll be asking themselves is will this pullback from Russian forces stop on the eastern bank of the Dnipro River, or will they move even further back, be forced to move further back in the coming days?
So how big a blow is this for President Putin, abandoning the only centre captured by Russia?
Well, what we've seen from Sergei Shoigu, who is the Russian defense minister, on Russian television just in the last hour or so, he said that we will save the lives of our soldiers and fighting capacity of our units. So what we're seeing here from the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to present this as really an organized retreat, as a tactical move as we head into the winter months, and not some sort of retreat in the face of a Ukrainian onslaught. It's also worth noting that just in the last couple of days or so, we've seen some reports from pro-Kremlin bloggers inside Russia, military bloggers, talking about units in eastern Ukraine, right in this area that we are discussing, taking really heavy casualties. The Russian Ministry of Defense in Moscow has had to issue a very specific denial to some of those reports, saying that their units are not taking the sorts of casualties that are being discussed. But look, this latest development is certainly going to support that narrative, really, that the Ukrainians have been putting forward, that they have been making advances, and that they have been taking, the Russians have been taking a lot of casualties in the last few days, in the last few weeks.
So are we now seeing the beginning of the end, or is this just a strategic and possibly temporary withdrawal before winter starts?
I think the next couple of days are going to be absolutely crucial, and as I mentioned, that's what NATO powers and, of course, the Ukrainians are going to be watching. Are we going to see the Russians digging in right on the eastern bank of that crucial river that I was talking about, the Dnipro River, or are they going to be forced even further back? Of course, the timing of all of this, we always expected to see the Ukrainians and the Russians digging in at this time of year as we head into the winter months, when, of course, it gets so much more complicated in terms of supplying troops, in terms of the weather, in terms of the conditions on the front lines. But as I say, the next couple of days, they're going to be absolutely critical as we watch to see exactly where the Russian front line settles down now that they are saying that they are retreating across the Kherson River, the Dnipro River, excuse me, in this really important moment in this conflict.
Giles, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Giles Gibson.
Now, the rest of the day's news, and Democrats in the United States appear to have defied the expectations in the midterm elections, holding on to a number of key seats they'd been predicted to lose. Republicans still look set to take control of the House of Representatives, where all 435 seats are up for grabs. The Democrats currently have 172 compared to 199 for the Republicans, with 218 needed for a majority. But the fight for the control of the Senate is a lot closer. The Democrats and Republicans are now level pegging on 48 votes each. If it ends up split 50-50, the Democrats can rely on the casting vote of the vice president. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's watching the day for us in New York. John, this is not the finished picture yet. Clearly some influential states to declare, but just talk us through what we know.
Yes. Well, I wanted to explain to our viewers just how big this election was. I mean, the way they do it in America, every 2 years they have an election. 1 year it's for the president and 2/3 of the Senate. And this year that we've just lived through is for the whole of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate. And when people go to the polls, they're confronted with a great long piece of paper. And in New York's case, they have to put a tick off against multiple names for the governor, for their senator, for their congressperson, for the state attorney general, for the state comptroller, which is the money person, and several judges, for example. That's what they've been voting on here in New York. But let's concentrate on the key headline story, which is control of the Congress in Washington, D.C. That's to say the House and the Senate. Now, as things stand at the moment, the House of Representatives, the People's House, is leaning towards being controlled by the Republican Party. And in part, that is because of 3 seats flipping here in New York and 1 flipping to the Republicans in New Jersey. As you rightly say, they need a majority of 218. If they get to 218, anything after that is their majority. Now, as for the Senate, it is a very different story because there are 4 key Senate races which are still outstanding on the day after polling happened. And they would be Arizona and Nevada in the southwest of the country, Georgia in the south of the country, and the state of Wisconsin, which is in the midwest of the country. Now let's concentrate on Georgia for a second, because everything suggests that there will have to be a runoff there. And the reason for that is the 2 candidates, Herschel Walker, who's a former football star representing the Republicans, and Raphael Warnock, who actually holds the seat at the moment and is the pastor at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Martin Luther King Jr. was also co-pastor at one stage. These 2 have not got the 50% required, or we don't think they will, in order to win the race outright. So there will be likely a runoff in early December. And the parties, if it turns out that this is the seat that will end up controlling potentially the Senate, they will throw everything at this seat. They will be spending on political advertising like you have never seen. They will throw the kitchen sink at it. That's how important it will be to both parties. But the downside for both parties, of course, means that in Georgia, this is likely to rumble on and on and on with more awful political ads in every ad break on television and on the radio for another couple of weeks. And that could lead to voter fatigue. So it's not very good for either party, the prospect of that happening. But it looks like it's going to.
I know it's early, but any response from the Republicans, yes?
No, I don't really expect any major response from either party. And the reason for that is we have a history in recent American political elections where people or parties have come out and claimed victory and only to have to row it back afterwards. So I don't think we're going to hear anything from any of the major players, although I guess we might do. I do know that the Republicans are bewildered and angry. They were promised a red wave yesterday, and what they got was basically a red ripple, or as one commentator put it here on television this morning, a red puddle. Now, I do want to make it very clear for our viewers, the Republicans had a good night. They did, all across the country, in various jurisdictions and in various ways. They had a good night. It's just that they didn't have the night that they thought they were going to have. It looks as if their agenda to concentrate on the economy and crime was overshadowed by President Biden's decision to have the Democrats concentrate on abortion and the threat to democracy. It looks as if with those two topics he was able to stave off that Republican red wave. So the polls got it wrong yet again. Now, in conclusion, everything at the moment, this hour, suggests that the Republicans will control the House, but it will be a tiny majority. They were expecting a vast majority. It will, in fact, be quite small. However, that doesn't stop them from slowing down and blocking Joe Biden's agenda in the course of the next 2 years. And it also means that they will be able to launch some investigations into Biden and the Democrats, just as the Democrats have done to them over the last 2 years. As for Biden, finally, he said that losing control of both houses would be a horrible 2 years. He will go on pushing his agenda, but he needs to be even more bipartisan now, if things play out the way we think they're going to play out, than he was before. Guys?
John, thank you for that. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Well, let's talk to Timothy Hagel, who's Professor of Political Science at the University of Iowa. Welcome to the programme. So the picture still emerging in the United States, but do the results that we've seen so far suggest that it's all over for Donald Trump's ambitions to run for president again?
It certainly is a blow to those for a couple of reasons. One is that it simply hit the candidates that he was supporting didn't seem to have a very good night. Part of that, of course, was that the Democratic Governors Association was also pouring money into some of the candidates it thought would be more vulnerable in a general election, and that strategy seemed to work relatively well, too. We also, of course, had DeSantis, the governor of Florida, won big, one of the bright spots for Republicans, and that also seems to diminish the possibility of people wanting, meaning the voters, wanting Trump to come back and have another go at it.
So the Democrats have, by and large, done better than had been expected. What does this mean for the party and for President Biden?
Well, it basically staves off a huge defeat, but it doesn't do them particularly that much good on the whole. They still have a variety of problems to deal with: inflation, high gas prices, supply chain issues, and these sorts of things. But they managed to at least avoid that red wave. And certainly to the extent that Republicans, if they do get control of the House, it will stop Biden's agenda to a certain extent. But on the other hand, his agenda was stopped to some extent because he didn't have enough votes in the Senate, even though he had technically a majority with potentially Vice President Harris casting the deciding vote. And that's because of the filibuster. So what Biden has opted to do, as Obama did as president, was use his executive power. Now, of course, some of that's going to be challenged. And, of course, as your correspondent indicated, if the Republicans control the House, there are going to be investigations and such. But for Biden, it's basically just sort of a holding action more than anything else. And I think a lot of voters are probably not going to be, Democratic voters are probably not going to be overly happy with having him run in 2024 as well. So we may see a possibility that neither Biden nor Trump ends up being the nominee for their major parties.
Let's talk a little bit about his agenda, because Ukraine is becoming an issue for some on the Republican right. What would this mean if the Democrats lose their majority in the House of Representatives for the country's stance on Ukraine?
Well, one of the things that some Republicans, and again, there's some dissension among the Republicans, is how they want to deal with this. That certainly there are concerns about making sure that Ukraine doesn't lose. But on the other hand, there's got to be an end game here. In other words, it can't just be a constant flow of money, partly because that's what's causing inflation here in the United States. And so basically they want to see a better strategy. Now, foreign policy is not usually something that directly affects American elections, especially the midterms, where it's the domestic kitchen table, jobs, economy, and healthcare type issues that tend to dominate, and this time abortion seemed to as well. So foreign policy may become a bigger issue down the road, and especially if Republicans start to push back and say, look, we can't just keep spending money to Ukraine. Now, again, if Russia has withdrawn to certain lengths, if maybe that's a signal that they're going to pull out entirely or have a different strategy, maybe there's going to be some kind of ceasefire. You know, we can only hope that that's going to end quickly, but if it doesn't, then Republicans may start to exert more force, at least in the House, and maybe try to convince people that, okay, we need to have a better idea of what the U.S.'s role here is, and it needs to have, again, some sort of end game so that we don't get caught in some sort of, as the phrase goes, an endless war.
Professor Timothy Hagel from the University of Iowa, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
China says it's willing to contribute towards a compensation fund for poorer countries hit by climate change.
The country's climate envoy, Xie Jianhua, was speaking on day 3 of the COP27 climate conference in Egypt. China and the United States have also held informal climate discussions at the conference, despite a formal suspension of bilateral talks earlier this year. Well, our correspondent Adel El-Marouki is in Sharm el-Sheikh. So, Adel, what more can you tell us about what China's climate envoy has said and those talks with the US?
The Chinese climate envoy said that because of climate issues are so pressing, he and Mr. Kerry, John Kerry, decided to resume the informal talks. And he also indicated that actually throughout the past period where official channels were locked, they have exchanged letters and consultations about climate issues. And therefore, the Chinese climate envoy says that the communication in terms of climate issues have not stopped, and that both of them agreed during their communication here in Sharm el-Sheikh that they will both support the Egyptian presidency to maintain a successful COP27. And this comes as pressure mounts over the top emission nations and the richest industrial nations to support loss and damage. And this is where the Chinese climate envoy stressed that China will support its fellow developing nations who are the most vulnerable to climate change. Let's have a listen.
As the biggest developing country, China voluntarily takes the responsibility which matches its international identity. Beijing sets 2 targets, which are achieving a carbon emission peak before 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality before 2060. Here, I stress that it is before rather than by. China is making all of efforts to keep its promise.
So China wants to show cooperation with the rest of the developing nations, something that has already started in the field of environmental maintenance, adaptation and resilience. Between China and Egypt, through which Chinese technology and devices were introduced to establish a green city of Sharm el-Sheikh as it hosts COP27. And throughout the sessions that will be following in the coming days, the Chinese envoy will be presenting Chinese technologies and initiatives that has proven to be quite efficient in reducing emissions and maintaining a greener environment.
Adel El-Marouki in Sharm el-Sheikh, thank you.
Axel van Trotzenberg is Managing Director of Operations at the World Bank. I asked him to explain what the World Bank is planning to do to help poorer countries cope with climate change.
Well, as you know, we are greatly concerned about all the impacts of climate change, but particularly the most vulnerable countries, be it the small island states, be it countries in Africa, are disproportionately affected by climate change and its impact. So they need special protection. There, the idea of a global shield was created to provide financing, particularly also preventive financing. So in case catastrophe hits, there will be immediate financing available. And that's the idea behind it. We got a first pledge by the German government of $170 million, so we are good to a good start.
Making commitments is one thing, delivering is quite another. What are your expectations for the scaling of global climate finance?
Well, I think first of all, we look to ourselves to scale, and we have been scaling massively our support, basically almost increasing by 80% over the last 3 years. So we reached $32 billion. This is what is necessary. We would like to do more, and we would like that the international community joins in an aggressive effort to really scale up the financing, go beyond the pledges, but make the commitments and the disbursements. That is what we are doing, and that is what is necessary.
What is your honest assessment of the progress, or otherwise, that's been done and made in the last 12 months since the COP in Glasgow?
I think the great thing what happened in Glasgow was that we brought climate change and financing really for the first time together. There was a lot of prominence by finance ministers, and now there is much more of that recognition. So here in Sharm el-Sheikh, the challenge is to keep the momentum, build the momentum, so that all the financiers are stepping up. That can be of the multilateral side, like the World Bank, but should also be the bilateral commercial side and the private sector. That is what is needed, and that is a longer-term process, but I think that is also what I'm looking for here at COP27, that we take the next step and ultimately translate announcement into real commitments.
It's easy to suggest this should be a priority, obviously, for national governments around the world, but what role do you see the private sector playing in these negotiations and efforts?
Well, the challenge is that the requirements to combat climate change are going to reach the trillions of dollars, and the governments simply don't have the resources. So therefore, we will need to seek an alliance with the private sector, and it is also good business decisions that to work towards a more sustainable planet, that should be also in the interest of the private sector. So we need their active participation. The good news is that the awareness is really broadening, and I think a lot of private sector operators, be it from the financial side, but also from the real economy side, are on board with that, and that is what we need, and I think we need to build on.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Belgium on strike. The country is brought to a virtual standstill in protests over the cost of living.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe, and a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
At least 10 people have been arrested after clashes between Greek workers and police in Athens. Officers fired tear gas to disperse crowds after people marched to demand more government help with the cost of living.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Evangelo Sipsas, who's in Athens for us. Evangelo, it looks quiet now. What's the story? What's been going on?
Well, now things here are quite quiet, as you mentioned, but earlier when the protesters went in front of the Greek parliament, they were met with riot police, and that's when everything happened. They stayed there for about an hour with the police telling them that they need to leave. The protesters did not listen, and that's when things happened. Then frustration was built, rocks were thrown towards the police, and petrol bombs, and then the police responded with tear gas, dispersing the crowd and running into side streets. People were arrested, over 10 people arrested. Some were injured, and a number of window shops were damaged. Now, all this was because this is a way that protesters channeled their frustration about the increasing prices in in energy and consumer goods. They're demanding that the government needs to do something and lower their taxes and increase their minimum wage, which currently stands at about $700. They say with this amount of money, we clearly cannot live. We cannot pay our rents, we cannot pay our electricity or any other utility bills, as everything continues to rise.
Evgenia is feeding cats in her neighborhood. It's one of the few routines she does before heading to her morning job. But she's not sure how much longer she'll be able to continue. Earning minimum wage, she was forced to pick up a second job, but the high cost means she cannot pay her bills.
I pay €300 for my rent and another 300 to the supermarket. Right there is my first monthly wage. The second one I put towards utility bills, heating, water and electricity, but it's still not enough. I currently owe over €600 of my electricity bill, and if I don't pay it soon, they'll cut me off.
To try to deal with a massive wave of price increases, the government is subsidizing fuel, cutting sales tax for businesses and students, and has launched a so-called household basket of lower-priced staple goods. But these measures have been met with discontent as Greeks continue to feel the impact in their wallets. On Wednesday, thousands of protesters gathered to denounce a model that they say is not working for them. They are demanding more government support measures to cushion the impact of inflation. The nationwide strike forced the country's largest port of Piraeus to cancel all scheduled trips and keep ferries tied up. Greek incomes were badly affected by the decade-long financial crisis and then the pandemic. Now Greeks have to contend with 12% inflation, a 30-year high. And it's pushing many still impacted by the 2008 financial crisis into poverty.
At first it was the financial crisis, then the pandemic came. Now we have an energy crisis and high inflation. And as they say, it's because of the war in Ukraine. They keep on cutting our salaries for the good of the country, but when will it be good for me? Since 2008, I've been in a state of financial crisis.
The government is pledging to do more in the coming months, but the thousands that came out on the streets of Athens say they feel vulnerable. The Greek government increased wages last May by adding around $50 extra a month. Now they're expected to increase that further from January. But the message from unions is that people cannot wait until the new year to get help. Warning, if the government doesn't act soon, there'll be further protests in the weeks and months ahead.
This is the first such protest that took place here in Greece over the inflation and the high energy costs. Now, the unions are saying that it won't be the last if the government doesn't sit down with them to discuss and find a solution to cushion the impact of inflation.
Hello, thank you for that. Our correspondent Evangelo Sipsas in Athens. Major trade unions in Belgium are staging their fourth strike this year in protest at the rising cost of living there. Workers across a number of sectors are calling for pay rises and a cap on energy prices.
The walkout has brought severe disruption to public transport. Brussels Airport has cancelled around half of its flights. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Rosie Burchard, who's in Brussels. So, Rosie, what's the situation there?
Well, I'm in the middle of a central Brussels train station, which is now currently at about rush hour, so you would expect it to be teeming with people. But as you can see, it's basically deserted. There are only a fraction of the normal amount of trains running. I think One of them is just arriving just now, about a quarter of local trains and just a third of those bigger trains which run between the cities here in Belgium. When it comes to more local public transport, just 1 out of 4 metro lines here in Brussels are running. And of course, you might, on a normal day, come here and get on a train to the airport. But as you mentioned, at Brussels Airport, more than half of flights have been cancelled, and airport operators are asking passengers to come with hand luggage only if they can, because they can't guarantee that their baggage will be loaded properly given these staff walkouts. In hospitals, meanwhile, a lot of non-essential operations and treatments have been put on standby. They're just operating an essential level of treatment, given, again, those staff walkouts from multiple sectors and multiple unions across the country. They say they are embroiled in a cost of living crisis and that they need more help from the government.
So they need more help from the government. What exactly do they want to see?
Well, the unions are calling above all for a cap on energy prices. They would like to see that kind of severe market intervention. Now, beyond that, they would also like to see a cap on rents, and they'd like some other interventions in the form of, for example, making sure that there's a broader windfall tax, so taxing excess profits. Now, the Belgian government acknowledges that this really is a difficult time for a lot of households and businesses here in Belgium. Inflation is well into double digits. Prices are rising and people are feeling it in their pockets. The Belgian government points to exceptional measures it's already rolled out. For example, about 1 million households are covered by a social energy tariff. That's essentially energy bill subsidies. And the government has rolled out a furlough scheme for struggling firms. Above all, the government is reminding workers that here in Belgium, unlike many neighbouring countries, salaries are indexed to inflation, most of them at least, which means that they should rise automatically as prices increase. But workers are saying that given the high energy bills, given this cost of living crisis they say they are facing in everyday life, they say that indexation and those other support measures simply aren't enough.
Rosie, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Rosie Burchard, in Brussels.
Nurses across the UK have announced their first ever national strike as they call for a 5% above inflation pay rise. The walkout was voted for by more than 300,000 members of the Royal College of Nursing Union. It's thought that patients will now face disruption to operations and routine appointments in industrial action that's expected to take place before Christmas.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Paradise Lost. How bird flu is savaging the world's wild flocks in one of the worst ever outbreaks.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw. The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. In the last hour, Russia has ordered its soldiers to withdraw from the strategically important city of Kherson in Ukraine.
Our other headlines, control of the United States Congress is on a knife edge as Democrats stave off a red wave surge from the Republicans in midterm elections.
And China says it's willing to contribute towards a compensation fund for poorer nations hit by climate change as world leaders gather in Egypt for COP27.
Let's get more now on the COP27 climate summit in Egypt. Day three's focus has been on finance, as we've been reporting, with a push to create a new loss and damage fund to support poorer countries who have done little to cause climate change, but of course bear the brunt of its effects. Let's talk to Mangaliswa Ndulo, Zimbabwe's Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry Minister. Minister, welcome to the programme. Thank you very much indeed for your time. From what you're seeing there, given your country's perspective and your experience, is this anything other than a talking shop so far?
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for this very important question. I think every year when we gather in these conference of parties meetings, what is more important is it's really to justify our presence here, especially to the suffering communities that we live in our respective countries, particularly with respect to the developing countries, the least developed countries who are severely affected by climate change. And as you have already highlighted, a phenomenon that we least contributed to. My biggest worry is that I'm not seeing the traction. I'm seeing a lot of rhetoric, a lot of pledges, promises, a lot of noise around critical issues. So I have no doubt that at this point, no one can deny the existence of climate change. It's no longer a myth to some as people used to. But the challenge remains that we come here, we plead cases, we commit to do things, people make promises. Year after year, nothing is happening. We need to get to a point where leaders meet on such platforms and we hear, especially the big polluters, not committing, but reporting the progress from the previous conference of parties, what they have done to make sure that they are reducing their emissions, what are they doing to make sure that they are contributing in helping the developing countries to be able to cope with the adverse effects of climate change. It's undeniable that a lot of these countries in the developed world developed using fossil fuels. They have the financial muscle to help the developing countries transition in a just manner, transition in a manner that will not compromise the development aspirations of those countries, that will not compromise the suffering communities. But from what I'm seeing, I'm afraid it's nothing short of a talk show.
Well, that's a very gloomy analysis. Let me ask you then, from an African perspective, perhaps from a Zimbabwean perspective, what does COP27 have to deliver for you to view it as a success and be optimistic about the outcome in a few days' time?
There are a number of issues that, from a Zimbabwean perspective, but also from an African perspective, that we have raised and which are very critical. The first and most critical one for us really is to make sure that the issue of climate financing is dealt with. And it's a moving target, if I may put it that way. It's a moving target in that the developed countries committed to contribute $100 billion annually, and this was supposed to start in 2020. We were shocked last year when we were in Glasgow, when the reports from the developed countries indicated that they had contributed $83 billion for last year towards climate financing. And it was clear at that point that there is need for a clear definition of what we mean by climate financing. That is the first part. Secondly, whether or not climate financing should come in the form of a grant or in the form of loans. A few countries that can demonstrate that they have contributed to developing countries' efforts in fighting climate change have done so in the form of loans. And again, that's another problem that we are creating. In the near future, there will be huge debt burden, which is climate related, which we want to avoid. So the critical issue first is climate finance that has to be defined. And we would want a situation where we have a specific fund, climate fund, and clear guidelines on how countries can access these funds. Of course, we don't want to compromise the processes, so they still need to make sure that there are bankable projects that are done, but a clear process has to be identified.
Minister, thank you very sorry to interrupt you. The time is against us somewhat, and I wish we had more time, but we're very grateful for your expertise and your time. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme.
Okay, you're welcome.
Consumer prices are continuing to rise in China, but at a slower pace, according to the latest economic data.
Meanwhile, the cost of goods charged by factories has fallen for the first time since last year. Our correspondent Sao Bing now reports.
The National Bureau of Statistics says China's Consumer Price Index, or CPI, a main gauge of inflation, has grown less than expected to mark a 2.1% annual increase. The year-on-year number improved compared to last month's yearly growth of 2.8%. Consumer prices for October landed at 0.1%, 0.2 percentage points less compared to September. The Bureau has attributed the stable CPI performance to the falling demand after the National Day holiday and a high base of comparison to last year. In specific, data show that food prices increased by 7%, down from 8.8% in September compared with a year ago. Vegetable prices appear to be a main drag. They decreased by 8.1 percentage points, cooling down from an increase of 12.1% in September. The price of pork, a staple meat in China, went up by nearly 52% in October. That's 16 percentage points more than September. Authorities say the rise was mainly driven by the shortage of supply, seasonal strengthening consumer demand, and a reluctance to sell at the market. The data also shows the country's Producer Price Index, or PPI, which measures costs for goods at the factory gate, went down by 1.3% year-on-year in October, marking the first decline since December last year. On a monthly basis, PPI went up by 0.2%. Aside from some contractions in the mining and refinery sectors, authorities also attributed the negative growth to last year's high base. Cao Bing, CGTN, Beijing.
The German government has blocked Chinese investors from buying a chip plant in the country.
Berlin vetoed the takeover of the Elmos factory over concerns about potential national security threats in the semiconductor market. It comes days after a visit to Beijing by Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who's trying to balance Germany's economic interests and European strategic concerns.
China is and must remain a trading partner. However, we must not be naive, and we must see whether the interests of trade and the market risk are being used for power politics against the interests of the Federal Republic of Germany.
All countries, including Germany, should provide a fair, open and non-discriminatory market environment for Chinese enterprises and refrain from politicizing normal economic and trade cooperation, not to mention protectionism on the grounds of national security.
India's foreign minister says Delhi will continue to buy Russian oil because his country needs it. His comments came during his visit to Moscow. India has emerged as Russia's second largest oil consumer after Western countries stopped purchases over the invasion of Ukraine.
Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have suffered a second day of sharp falls amid concern over the stability of FTX, one of the world's largest exchanges. Speculation over the company's financial health led to more than $6 billion being withdrawn in 72 hours. Rival crypto exchange Binance has agreed a rescue deal for FTX, but it's so far failed to calm investor concerns.
The sports company Adidas has downgraded its outlook after terminating its contract with Kanye West's Yeezy brand. Adidas says net income is likely to be around $250 million, half of the previous target of $500 million. The company ended its relationship with the musician after he made a series of anti-Semitic comments on social media.
England has brought in a lockdown for commercial poultry as a virulent strain of avian flu sweeps the globe. The pandemic has left tens of millions of birds dead and is threatening entire species.
The outbreak is also ripping through wild bird populations where it's all but impossible to contain. CGTN's correspondent Guy Henderson reports from the world's largest breeding site for gannets off the coast of Scotland. And a warning, his report contains images that you might find upsetting.
A pre-dawn launch from North Berwick Harbour. The scene of an unprecedented tragedy lies 5 kilometres offshore. So we head east along the coastline and the half-light towards Bass Rock. Before us, only Maggie Shedden from the Scottish Seabird Centre has witnessed what lies ahead. Because access to the world's largest breeding site for northern gannets, one of the wonders of the wildlife world, had been strictly forbidden for months.
Guys!
With the season over, landing is finally permitted. The Rock's 150,000 strong seasonal inhabitants have either moved on, or as we start to see for ourselves as we ascend the cliffside,
I mean, it's just been a season of unprecedented happenings.
Never took off.
We had gannets washing up on the shoreline.
And at that time, this whole rock would have been absolutely covered.
Yes, it was alive, absolutely alive.
Within weeks, Maggie was filming disturbing scenes like these all over the rock. Thousands of desperate creatures who'd come to give new life, instead fighting dizziness, blindness, then organ failure, ultimately in vain. Most gannets that catch the avian flu virus that ripped through here end up dead. So now this place is littered with carcasses.
Tens of millions of birds have probably perished from this strain of avian flu. And once it gets into wild species like these, it's impossible to contain. It's very hard to even track it. That's worth taking note of in a world where most new infectious diseases that affect us humans originate in other animals first and then mutate.
Experts stress the risk to humans remains extremely low. But back on shore, Susan Davies, who's the head of the Scottish Seabird Centre, says this has been a wake-up call.
I think we were all caught on the back foot with this and the scale of the impact that's happened. But there is now in Scotland and at UK levels much better coordination on avian flu in terms of a response group, a task force, as a result of what's happened this year. And through that group there will be more coordinated effort in terms of surveillance.
The immediate threat is to commercial farms, where this week the British government brought in lockdowns to try and keep the virus out. This is a global problem though, with cases now widespread. And in Scotland there are signs of a coming second wave. Maggie worries the survival of entire wild bird species could be at risk if this keeps going. And she's not alone.
We've seen COVID, we've seen what that did to humans. Well, this is probably something similar with wildlife, and it can spread to other wildlife. There are reports of seals, and I believe there's a black bear and other species, and it is in other wild bird species from raptors right through to your sort of ducks, swans. It's going to be really slippy.
As we leave, the odd healthy gull can be heard overhead. That's a cause for hope. Some birds are being hit hard, others much less, or not at all. That no one knows exactly why yet, though, is itself a cause for concern about what next season may or may not hold here, and far, far beyond. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Bass Rock.
Facebook parent company Meta is laying off 11,000 employees. The job cuts amount to 13% of its global workforce and are the first major layoffs in the tech giant's history. It follows large cuts at other US tech firms, including Microsoft and Twitter. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said that revenues had been much lower than expected. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Mark New, who's in Silicon Valley in California. So, Mark, what's the reason for these layoffs?
That's right. More than 11,000 workers laid off is its most significant layoffs ever. That's about 13% of the workforce. Meta's stock is actually getting a little bump as of this morning, up about 6 or 7% on last check. Now, prior to the word of pending layoffs a few days ago, the stock had been down more than 72% in 2022, by far the worst performer on the S&P 500 this year. In a written message to employees, Zuckerberg announced the cuts, writing that he was sharing some of the most difficult changes he's made in Meta's history. He said they were also taking a number of additional steps to become a leaner and more efficient company by cutting discretionary spending and extending a hiring freeze through Q1. He said, I want to take accountability for these decisions and for how we got here. Meta is heavily investing in the metaverse, the interconnected virtual worlds that has been slow to take off. That big bet has cost Meta $9.4 billion so far in 2022. The company anticipates that losses will grow significantly year over year. And how did they get there? Well, Zuckerberg said that COVID actually led to a surge in e-commerce, led to outsized revenue growth. He, like many others, predicted that growth would continue, and it did not, which means they invested heavily, leaving them hung out to dry in the economic climate that we are now facing. He also cited ad signal loss. That's a reference to, among others, Apple and that do not track feature that is appearing on phones all the time. When people opt out of that, that inevitably lessens the value of those advertisements. Back to you.
Well, Mark, Meta not alone in cutting jobs, of course. What's the mood in the wider tech industry right now?
That's right. Very grim. This is becoming a weekly occurrence, or might I even say a daily occurrence. Twitter, acquired by Elon Musk, started tech's biggest layoffs on Thursday. No one knows exactly how much, expected to be at least 50%, around 3,700 workers. Ride-sharing app Lyft, 13%. That's about 700 employees. Fintech company Stripe, around 14%. Now, cloud customer relationship company Salesforce just yesterday announced several hundred would be laid off. It's an almost ironic situation because there are actually still more high-tech engineering jobs than there are to fill them. And we were just dealing with the great resignation, where workers, especially in the high-paid tech world, were quitting in high numbers as the pandemic gave them time to reflect and contemplate on what they really wanted to do in life. So the shift has been very fast and sudden, though I do anticipate a lot of these talented workers may be bringing their talents to smaller startups. They'll pay in benefits in those operations are far less.
Mark, thank you very much. That's our correspondent, Mark New, in California.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, robots that can even feel your emotions. Just some of the attractions of China's International Import Expo in Shanghai.
This week on a Razor COP27 special, producing electricity by wind without turbines, an alternative method to achieving nuclear fusion, and creating a revolutionary construction material from fungi.
1 square meter of mycelium insulation produced can sequester 0.8 to 1.7 kilograms of carbon.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The final mission to resupply cargo to China's space station is preparing to launch in Hainan.
The Tianzhou 5 cargo spacecraft is helping with the construction of the Tiangong space station, which is expected to be completed by the end of this year. Our correspondent Zhong Yibing reports.
After China's space station 4 in its basic configuration in T-shape, here comes the next construction mission, the launch of the Tianzhou 5 cargo ship. Now the flight combination is being transported to the launch pad. The cargo ship will replace its predecessor, Tianzhou 4, which was launched in May this year. Its main job is to deliver supplies to the station.
It mainly has 3 experimental payloads, including a popular science satellite, a fuel cell, and a high-energy particle detector. The cargo ship is refueled, and its weight is about 13.2 tons.
The carrier rocket for Tianzhou cargo ship missions is a Long March 7.
After the rocket enters the launch area, it will connect with the ground system and go through a system checkup. It's expected to be refueled on November 12th. There was light rain today during transportation, but the rocket is water and moisture proof, so it's safe in such situations.
And an expert from the Superior Unit said the launch site is going through strict tests.
Before the transportation, we carried out rigorous tests on the flight combination. And after this, we'll fully connect the rocket to the launch pad and prepare for refueling, system checkup, and launch.
It's the last cargo ship launch mission before the completion of China's space station. Now, at the Wenchang spacecraft launch site, all systems are getting ready. Zheng Yibing, CGTN, Wenchang.
From robots that play games with you to goggles that make you feel you're in another world, new technology is one of the sectors on show at the China International Import Expo trade event. Our correspondent Dai Kai reports.
5 years in the making, the CIE has drawn a packed house in its first several days. What's new at the Intelligent Equipment Exhibition area this year? What products, technology, and solutions do they bring to the table? Let's go check it out. Robotic arms all over the place. Some of them for manufacturing cars, others simply for fun. I just came across something pretty cool and I want to show you guys. This one is a robot that plays ping pong with you. I've never played ping pong with robots, so I'm going to challenge it. I tried jump smash, I tried putting a spin on it, nothing worked. One thing new here are electronics that give you feedback. A robot with emotional sensors or emotional intelligence AI built in to really analyze how focused you are, how well you serve, and whether you're getting angry or happy. If you're in a good mood, then the game is going to pick up a little bit, but if it senses that you're frustrated because you're not doing well, then it's going to back off. What they really want to show you is that you can get real-time feedback from the machines and robots, and I love how it analyzes you and then pushes you out of your comfort zone to play maybe a little above your level, so you might always feel a bit challenged when playing against it. The robot here in front of me can scan my face and then complete a real-time portrait. The entire process, I'm told, takes only about 1 to 2 minutes. There are laser projectors that present a fully immersive summer palace to viewers. And speaking of immersive, this virtual football field is what really excites me. Well, you still get to run around and kick the ball, but with this technology, you can play football without even stepping out of your room. And just by putting on goggles, you can instantly immerse yourself into places you've only dreamed of. Technology involving the metaverse is another of the highlights in this exhibition area. From playing table tennis to being in a metaverse virtual world, intelligent equipment comprises much more than most people think. They can be entertaining and also paradigm shifting. So I would encourage everyone who has the chance to come and see for themselves. These machines, they're not just problem solvers, they're game changers.
Two dozen beautifully preserved bronze statues, which experts have described as exceptional, have been discovered in Italy.
The statues, thought to date back to ancient Roman times, were found under the ruins of an ancient thermal bath in Tuscany, alongside around 6,000 coins. It's thought the hot spring water helped to preserve the statues, which will now be taken for restoration before going on public display.
The headlines again. Russia orders its soldiers to withdraw from the strategically important city of Kherson in Ukraine.
Our other headlines: control of the United States Congress is on a knife edge as Democrats stave off a red wave surge from the Republicans in the midterm elections.
And China says it's willing to contribute towards a compensation fund for poorer nations hit by climate change as world powers gather in Egypt for COP27.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.